Hey everybody, good afternoon. Why don't we get started if we could. If there's some people I see still coming in, there's a few seats down here front if people would like to join. Front seats are always the best. So I'm Matt Slaughter. I'm Dean of the Tuck School here at Dartmouth, and I just want to welcome everybody to this first of 4 Inauguration Week panels that we on campus here at Dartmouth are convening. The theme of these panels is opportunities and risks. We live in an interesting world. We live in an interesting country here in the United States, for those of us that are U.S. citizens. And we have a new president and new Congress taking office here in the United States. And so it seems like an especially important time, given where the world is, given where the United States is, to bring together in our Dartmouth communities some of our brightest minds to engage in open discussion on kind of where the United States and where the world is. And as the title of the series here indicates, what are the opportunities and risks going forward? So there are 4 panels that we will be convening each of today through Friday afternoon here on campus. And for each of those, we've assembled kind of a theme. This one is on, broadly speaking, some domestic policy issues, where we've gathered 4 faculty members for this panel from across campus. I'll introduce them each in a minute. And each of these 4 panels across the 4 days will be an opportunity for the community, the faculty, the students, the staff, the broader Upper Valley community to come together and hear from some great minds and engage in a dialogue on where we are. That's kind of the learning goal for these. And I'm just serving as moderator here for the first of these events. Because this is the first of those 4 events, I'll just say a couple of things, just of words of thanks. This has been a real terrific One Dartmouth effort. The genesis for this, the one individual I want to single out most of all, is Bob Hansen, who's sitting in the audience over there, a colleague here at the Tuck School. That's you, Bob. It was he who, not too long before the winter break, had the genesis idea. He and I ran into each other at the co-op grocery store and talked a little bit, and as things often happen here in Hanover, in the Upper Valley, suddenly something came of that. And so Bob Hansen in particular, given his long interest in public policy and his teaching interest, really was the genesis for this. But it's been a lot of people coming together from here at the Tuck School, from Arts and Sciences, from Geisel, from Thayer, and from the President's office as well. I would just want to thank in particular a few other people. One of the panelists, Andrew Samwick here, who's also the faculty director for the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy. Andrew was central. Here at Tuck, Merritt Patridge, who's the executive director of our Center for Business, Government, and Society. I also want to thank Ed Winchester and our whole communications team here at the Tuck School, and Maria Ferbatko, who's in the dean's office with us. So there was a bunch of people who thematically, conceptually, and in terms of the logistics, really came together quite quickly to pull together 4 panels that we hope are really going to enrich our community at this interesting time in history. So just thanks to everybody who's involved with that. So the structure of today's panel is each of our 4 faculty members will take about 5-7 minutes to share some opening thoughts. I, as moderator, will moderate some initial questions and conversation among the 4 of us here. And then for about half of the remaining time, we will go for till about 5:30. We will open up to the general audience here for questions. And I think maybe we'll have a microphone or 2 running around for questions. This is being live streamed and also recorded, so I think use of microphone in the questions will be important. If you happen not to have a microphone at the time, I'll try to repeat the question. But please remember, we're seeking from the audience questions, not soliloquies or statements. And I'll do my best to kind of bring the questions across the insights and expertise of our 4 panelists. So their names and titles are up here. I will just briefly say we have the good fortune to draw on a number of parts of disciplines and departments on campus. So the order in which we'll progress is just down the table here. We'll start with Dean. Dean Lacy serves as the chair of the government department here. He's also the professor of government and directs the program in politics and law here at Dartmouth. Then we have Elizabeth Cascio. Liz is an associate professor of economics here at Dartmouth. Then we have Richard Wright. Richard serves as a professor of geography and also the Orvil Dryfoos professor of public affairs. And as I mentioned, Andrew Samwick. Andrew is also, in addition to heading the Rockefeller Center, he's the Arthur and Sandra Irving Professor of Economics. So we've got people from distinct backgrounds and disciplines who are going to share some thoughts on governance, on education, on immigration, and broad fiscal policy. 4 probably the most important domestic policy issues. They're clearly related to each other. We'll hear some opening thoughts from each of them. I'll start the conversation with a few questions, and then we'll open up to the full house that we have here. So we'll start with Dee.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming and for organizing this event. You know, Donald Trump presents a bit of a conundrum for us. I thought I knew something about politics before November, and now I'm not sure that I do. And predicting what Donald Trump will do in office is in many ways harder than predicting what any other president in American history would have done in office. And that's because Donald Trump enters the White House with the least political experience of anyone who's ever held the office. Let me read for you the list of presidents, I had to print them out, who've never held an elected office. Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, William Howard Taft, Herbert Hoover, Dwight Eisenhower. Aside from Eisenhower, it's not a very distinguished lot. If you take the average rating by a number of panels of historians over time, Taylor, Grant, Taft, and Hoover are all well in the bottom half. Now, what's interesting is each one of those five, though, even though they never held an elected office, held an office of public trust. Taylor, Grant, and Eisenhower were generals, but another way to think about that is that they managed one of the largest public bureaucracies in the U.S. government. William Howard Taft was Secretary of War, Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce. So all of them had at some stages in their career held an office of public trust. Now, one who you might think is missing from this list is George Washington, who actually had an elective office. He was a county surveyor, which back in his time was a critically important office, but he was also a member of the Continental Congress with some legislative experience. We also, since Donald Trump hasn't been a governor or senator or a member of Congress like many prior presidents, we don't know his policy positions. He doesn't have a track record that we can follow to predict what he'll do in office. The cabinet picks thus far suggest that he's more conservative than we expected when he was running for president. From his chief of staff, Reince Priebus, who is chairman of the Republican National Committee, to a number of his nominees for cabinet-level secretary positions, they've been pretty mainstream to conservative Republicans for the most part. How might Donald Trump manage the White House? Well, the political science literature tells us there are two different managing styles and maybe poles, and that most presidents fall somewhere in between the spokes of the wheel model, where they're the center of everything. They have their hands in every decision and in every office of government, and the hierarchical model. Democrats tend to be spokes of the wheel managers, from FDR to Clinton, managing almost everything, even in Clinton's case at 4 a.m., where he would call cabinet secretaries and others to ask what they're doing. And the Republicans tend to be hierarchical. Everything about Donald Trump suggests he's going to be a spokes of the wheel manager, involved in everything and not a hierarchical manager. So that also presents a conundrum for us in predicting what he'll do. Since his cabinet picks are conservative, he looks like a mainstream Republican, but his governing style looks like anything but. Donald Trump also has a great opportunity. His party holds majorities in both houses of Congress. It's rare that a Republican in particular gets unified government, and it's also rare that a president gets unified government. There are 52 Republican senators, 46 Democrats, and 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats, so he has a bare edge in the Senate, and there are 241 Republicans to 194 Democrats in the House of Representatives. The parties are also more polarized than they've ever been since the Civil War, since Reconstruction. That is, the average Democrat is further from the average Republican than at any time in American history, and there's no overlap, meaning there are no Democrats who are as conservative as some Republicans. There's a gap, a gulf between the parties. That means that Trump probably will not get any Democratic votes on much of substance. The one that you might look for is Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who might support him on some initiatives. But that means that Trump has to hold on to all the Republicans in the Senate in order to get anything passed. And that may be difficult. And I would say that the person who probably could be the linchpin in that Republican majority in the Senate is Dartmouth's own Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, who came out, did not endorse Trump, opposed him during the nomination season, and is one of the more moderate Republicans and could be the deal maker. Trump also has a great problem. He has a great opportunity and a great problem. And that great problem is within his party there's regional variation on some of the most important issues that the party will address. That is, not all Republicans are in lockstep on most of the important issues. Region, self-interest, and the desire to be reelected trump, we'll have to find a new word for that, trump party identification when it comes to voting in the House and Senate. You may have seen that over the past several elections, the states that receive the most in federal spending per tax dollar paid are increasingly Republican. The South and the Great Plains are getting bankrolled by New England and the Pacific Rim, and to some extent the Great Lakes. The states that Trump won in the presidential election are more reliant on federal spending than the states that he lost. That means that his coalition is a group of people, or a group of states at least, that in some way depend on federal spending. Now, it's not all the same. It depends on which state you're in. It's the Farm Bill in the Great Plains. It could be military spending in the South, where there are preponderance of military bases. But whatever the state, whatever the congressional district, the Republicans are New Dealers too, which means they protect the federal spending programs that get them reelected and that help their constituents. This geography of representation can play itself out in a number of other ways. For instance, in trade policy. In 2004, the Bush administration, in anticipation of a tough presidential election, raised tariffs on imported steel. Why? Because the states of Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania were potentially in play in that election. The European Union responded with retaliatory tariffs on apples, pears, citrus, and textiles. We'll see your Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio and raise you Washington, Oregon, California, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. All right, so the politics of region also play out in international affairs. So Trump is a great mystery to most of us. We don't know how he'll govern, but he has a great opportunity with unified Republican government to get a lot done. His primary problem isn't with the Democrats, but with his own party and keeping them together based on their regional self-interest. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Dean. We'll hear from Elizabeth.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks to the organizers for the invitation to participate today. I'm looking forward to a productive conversation. So I'm going to be shifting gears to get a little bit more specific to talk about education, as was my charge. I'm going to be focused here in this introduction on K through 12 education, because I think that's where, if anywhere, where the most dramatic changes are likely to take place in federal education policy, and where the messaging actually coming out of the campaign has been clearest. To set the stage, the federal government spends about $64 billion annually on K through 12 education. That's actually pretty small change relative to other federal funding priorities. We're going to maybe hear a little bit more about that today or later on this week. It's also a small change relative to what the state and local governments spend on education, which was maybe about $570 billion annually. Or it stands at around there, which means that the federal government represents about 10% of all revenue for education. So this division of effort is not surprising. It actually has some pretty strong economic rationales beyond the political rationales related to the importance of states' rights and local rights in the foundation of our country. School districts actually provide efficient scale for many educational projects, and competition across school districts actually helps to create an environment where we go some of the distance towards getting to the sort of right level of education in society at large. And a lot of the redistribution that we might want to pursue can actually be achieved by states. This is redistribution, and many states have done this over the course since the 1970s, redistributing from wealthier to less wealthy districts in the interest of promoting equity. So at least from a financial perspective, the federal government's role in education is rightly a pretty limited one. And it's rightly limited to projects that state and local governments themselves can't easily achieve. Thinking beyond K through 12 education here for a moment, the financing of education research, which is a public good. Thinking about higher education for a second, intervention in student loan markets where a lack of collateral could lead to too little liquidity. And in the case of K through 12 education, thinking about ways or making redistributive efforts to redistribute not just within but across states. And in that spirit, the largest line item for K through 12 education in the federal budget is for programs for educationally disadvantaged children or for poor children. And these are programs that were originally funded under Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. That was passed during Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, or as part of his war on poverty. Another $14 billion supports free and reduced price lunch programs, also for lower income kids, and $11 billion for education of children with disabilities. Those are the sort of largest sort of things that the federal government does. But federal education policy doesn't begin and end with money. Where the controversy kind of arises is about the use of strings or conditions for the receipt of federal aid, as well as the use of new flows of federal aid. I was talking about existing flows a minute ago, the use of new funds to try to promote certain educational policies. So let's consider here, just to begin, strings on existing aid first. So these include the requirement of non-discrimination, of non-discriminatory use of federal funds. And this condition was notably used for a cause near and dear to my heart to begin in earnest the process of desegregating Southern schools. But it remains a really important function of the Department of Education to work to protect children's rights to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. Now, of course, the vigor of those enforcement efforts is potentially going to differ from administration to administration. Strings also include requirements that states adopt certain policies to continue to receive federal funds. So this brings us closer to understanding where federal education policy stands today. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, or NCLB, as I'll probably refer to it later, was the signature education legislation of the second Bush administration. And that legislation required states to adopt accountability programs that met pretty rigid guidelines in order to continue to receive their Title I aid. Now, somewhat ironically, in the fall of 2011, the Obama administration began to offer states waivers from these NCLB requirements, but they also tied strings to the receipt of the waivers. States were to adopt accountability systems with high standards, update their teacher evaluation systems, and intervene in certain ways in low-performing schools. Now, moving on to new flows of new aid and promoting new policies, a timely example of this is really Obama's signature education policy, which was Race to the Top. This was funded under the federal stimulus package in 2009, and it used competitive grants to advance reforms in particular areas, including teacher evaluation and turnaround efforts of low-performing schools. So strings or conditions and even competitive grants can be viewed as really heavy-handed on the part of the federal government. And indeed, the pendulum has swung back away from the federal government towards the states and towards school districts with passage by a very wide bipartisan majority, surprisingly for this era, of the Every Student Succeeds Act at the end of 2015. And that law is going to take full effect this fall, and it gives states much wider latitude in setting their accountability systems. There are a lot of wonky details here I'm not going to go into, but there is increased flexibility and discretion, and the point is pretty clear. Back off federal government. So indeed, it's interesting. The policies that were explicitly pushed by Obama, things like promoting teacher evaluation, have no place in this new law. It also really ties, interestingly, the hands of the Secretary of Education and what they can sort of tell states and school districts they're able to do. So interestingly, this is really the legacy of the Obama administration and Secretary Arne Duncan for the Trump administration, and potentially Betsy DeVos if she's confirmed. We're entering a period when the people have spoken and they want the federal government off their backs in terms of education. So without further congressional intervention, which is something we can maybe discuss a little bit more, which is a little bit challenging to predict what might happen there, ESSA, in many ways ties possibly Secretary DeVos's hands in promoting her agenda for school choice, which hopefully is something we're going to get a chance to talk a little bit more about.
Great. Thank you, Liz. Richard?
So thanks to the organizers and thanks to all of you for showing up and participating in this. We've got 7 minutes. My job is to talk about immigration. And there's been a lot of talk about the uncertainty associated with Donald Trump. And Dean talks about the uncertainties associated with this new president who's got this uncertain background. Well, I've got this 10-point immigration plan right here. It prints out on one page. There's one piece of writing in red on it. I'm going to talk about 5 of the 10 immigration points, and we can get to the other 5 in Q&A. So I'm going to spend 1 minute on each of the 5. Point number, Donald J. Trump's 10-point plan to put America first. This is under the immigration link on his website. Begin working on an impenetrable physical wall on the southern border on day 1, and in red, Mexico will pay for the wall. And you've all heard this. Day one now, I thought was going to be Friday, but I read in the paper recently day one is now Monday. So on Monday, we're going to build on Monday and start building on Monday, and Mexico will pay for it maybe on Monday. My colleagues at the panel will tell me more about how congressional purse strings work, but the likelihood of Mexico paying for it and the likelihood of day one congressional action on this, I think, is a little remote. So why focus on the southern border is a question that you might want to ask. If you want to end unauthorized migration to the United States, there are 2 points of interest. One might very well be the southern border, and about 50% of all those in the country without authorization do enter without inspection through mostly the southern border, but they come in through the northern border too, because we have that northern border with Canada. The other 50% of people who are in the country without authorization overstay their visas. So there is an enormous rhetoric and emphasis in the current moment about the southern border. And I think one of the things we should think very hard about is why that is, when the facts are, and I live in a factual world, that unauthorized immigration has this complexity to it that doesn't really get a full airing. Point 3, move criminal aliens out day one. In joint operations with local, state, and federal law enforcement, we will terminate the Obama administration's deadly non-enforcement policies that allow thousands of criminal aliens to roam freely on our streets. So this gets to the issue of who's a criminal and who's not. If you are in the country without authorization, that is not a criminal offense, that is a civil offense. It's very hard to find how many people who are criminal aliens. It's very hard to find estimates of the, well, it's not hard to find estimates of the unauthorized population. Most reasonable people reckon there's about 11 to 12 million people in the country without authorization. Of those 11 million people, a very small proportion are criminal aliens. Maybe the best, an estimate, I heard at a job talk yesterday, was 200,000. Donald Trump talks about 2 to 3 million criminal aliens, when the actual number, the factual number, is 200,000. 5, immediately terminate President Obama's 2 illegal executive amnesties. All immigration laws will be enforced. We will triple the number of ICE agents. Anyone who enters the country illegally is subject to deportation. That is what it means to have laws and to have a country. So let's focus on the first part of that statement. President Obama's 2 illegal executive amnesties. One of these executive orders didn't provide neither provided amnesty, first of all. That is a fact. They both attempted to provide relief from deportation from 2 populations among the unauthorized. The first population are the children who were brought here by their parents under aged 18. So DACA, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, refers to about the 800,000 people who were in the country without authorization, who were brought here by their parents as children. They did not participate in any migration decision or any decision to overstay a visa. So, as far as I'm concerned, they're certainly not criminals, but more importantly, they're innocent. The second, and that is in effect as of now, but on day one, that will, according to our incoming president, that will end. The other executive order has the acronym DAPA, Deferred Action on Parents of American Citizens and Lawful Permanent Residents. So this gets at the more thorny and complicated issue of parents who are in the country, adults who are in the country but have children who are citizens, or children who are LPRs, legal permanent residents, green card holders. That action has been held up in the courts and has never gone into effect. So I think we should hold, I think Donald Trump will indeed, this is an executive action that can be done at a stroke of a pen. And on Monday, we should anticipate both DACA and DAPA ending. And if they don't, that will be interesting. Number 9, turn off the jobs and benefit magnet. Many immigrants come to the United States illegally in search of jobs, even though federal law prohibits the employment of illegal immigrants. He's right. Most immigrants do. Most authorized and unauthorized immigrants migrate for economic reasons. That's migration theory that goes back hundreds, at least 100 years. But the first part of that statement, turn off the jobs and benefits magnet, links benefits to the unauthorized population. Very few unauthorized people move here for the benefits to which they are not eligible and cannot obtain. People who are in the country without authorization live clandestine lives. The last thing they want to do is interact with the authorities of any stripe. So this is a kind of odd statement, but again, you have to ask yourself, why are these things connected, and why is this rhetoric invoked? Last, number 5, reform legal immigration to serve the best interests of America and its workers, keeping immigration levels within historical norms. This is excellent. Two reasons why I think this is excellent. We are in desperate need of comprehensive immigration reform. So I am fully in favor of this. We do need comprehensive immigration reform. We've had comprehensive immigration legislation only a few times in this country's history. 2 times in the 1920s, once in 1952, once in 1965, and once in 1990. Do the math. We are due and possibly overdue for comprehensive immigration reform. So I am all in favor of this. Keeping immigration within its historic norms is actually another excellent statement that we need to think about. Immigration has varied tremendously like this, and so within its historical norms, let's just keep it to the mean and variance and not think about skewness or kurtosis, but just think about mean and variance here. If it's mean, that is deeply problematic because the mean is hard to determine because the variance is so great depending on the period. The time that the United States had some of the fewest foreign-born was in the 1950s and 1960s, 4.9% in the 1960s. And one of the things Trump has been able to leverage very effectively is a nostalgia for the 1950s and the 1960s. So when he says historic norms, he's not thinking of a 200-year time span. I think he's focused on the 1950s and 60s. We can talk about this and other things in a few moments.
Thank you, Richard. Andrew?
Thanks. I think I'm going to use my opening time to just try to establish a framework for thinking about the budget. There are lots of moving parts. It is inevitably something that is mired in percentages of this and percentages of that. So I want to just give you a guide for what to keep your eye on. So we need a term to describe our federal budget policy. I searched very far and wide for that, and I think the answer is a mess. The mess started in the 1980s when we conducted our first set of modern experiments with very large tax cuts, and then sort of lost control of the budget as a balanced entity. Those of you who were alive at the time may remember then candidate Reagan, or President-elect Reagan, railing against the $50 billion deficit that his predecessor had left to him. Those numbers were subsequently dwarfed by later deficits during the 1980s. It took about 15 years to climb back out of that hole, and it took a little bit of luck. Some of it was luck, some of it was good policy. Part of the luck might have been the peace dividend that we enjoyed as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It might be that we imposed a slight tax increase right before the internet bubble heated up, and a general agreement between two leaders, Newt Gingrich and President Clinton, that balancing the budget was something of import. And the combination of all those things sort of brought some sanity back to this process. Taxes as a share, federal taxes as a share of GDP peaked in the year 2000, and then we started cutting taxes again. And I think properly you have to call these the Bush-Obama tax cuts, because what Bush's administration did through a temporary reconciliation process eventually got ratified as our means of escaping the so-called fiscal cliff. Okay, so we're back in that environment in which budget balance is nowhere on the radar. All the while this was happening, say over the last 20 years, what we experienced was a very large cohort of workers, the baby boom generation, aging into their peak earnings years. The way we fund our old age entitlements is that we levy a payroll tax in general, or any tax, now, and then presumably put the money in a trust fund for use later. So while the baby boom generation is in its peak earnings years, those entitlement programs look temporarily cheap. But within 5 years, all baby boomers will be eligible for Medicare, which means that we've basically shifted this. And they will go from being the largest cohort paying in to the largest cohort now receiving. And so that window, which I used to enjoy saying was open, is basically now closed. And it would be very hard to capture any of the baby boom generation among the cohorts that are going to sort of pay for reconciling the long-term financial sustainability of those programs. Okay, and then if you just sort of look at policy, the last time we took this really seriously, not fiscal policy, but budget balance and the implication of being out of balance, it would have been the year that included the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which ultimately was not adopted, and then the next year, 2011, the Super Committee. And so it's really been off the radar. Okay, so how do you understand federal budget policy? I would say there's three main elements. The first is old age entitlements. And this is a subset of what budget authorities might call mandatory as opposed to programmatic, or mandatory as opposed to discretionary. I'm thinking about Social Security and Medicare, where we kind of recognize that there's a need to tax cohorts while they're working and then support cohorts to some extent while they're not working. So Social Security, based on the 2016 Trustees Report, has an unfunded obligation that equates to an average of about 1% of GDP when measured only over the next 75 years. That it's growing over that time period suggests to you that the 0.9% is a bit of an understatement. Okay, so that's an item that we will have to reconcile if we intend to keep that program running at comparable amounts of generosity for future generations. Medicare faces the same demographic and economic pressures as Social Security, plus the tendency for medical expenditures per capita to grow in excess of the growth rate of GDP. It also suffers from the fact that it has a smaller dedicated revenue source. That's principally the HI component of the payroll tax for hospital insurance and the premiums for Parts B and D, which are only really designed to cover about 25% of the cost of those programs. Well, over the next 75 years, there will be an increase in the demand on general revenues of another percentage point of GDP, and about 1/4 to 0.3% permanent unfunded liability in the hospital insurance part. Okay, so the headwinds are completely against us for our old age entitlements. What we should have, I think, is projected actuarial balance in our old age entitlements. The second piece is the non-entitlement budget. And if you thought about reasonable standards for that, the one I would prefer would be it's in budget balance over the course of a complete business cycle. In downturns, you run a deficit, but in upturns, you run a surplus. So in 2015 and in 2017, despite the fact that these were in 2007, we were at the peak of a business cycle. In 2015, we began what I refer to as a crest that has extended far beyond what I thought it would be. But we were at about 2.5% of GDP annual deficits. Right? So that's nowhere close to the budget to the surplus you would need if you were abiding by some standard of budget balance. Another standard that you might have would be There's no drift in the debt to GDP ratio, would be another way to describe a reasonable standard. So to put this in perspective, even in fiscal year 2000, which is when we had all those favorable factors coming together to support tax collections, we were only collecting about 20% of GDP in revenue. Expenditures in 2015 as a share of GDP were 20.7. So at a business cycle crest, not even our most highly taxed year would have been able to cover it. So that suggests to me that you have a structural problem. If you have a structural problem, you need a structural solution, and that means you've got to raise more revenue or you've got to cut some expenditures. Okay, and then the third thing that you need is you need some semblance of your annual average capital expenditures, and I would not suggest the additional complications of a formal capital budget, but what I would suggest is that we have a set of large capital projects teed up and ready to go so that we can use expenditures on infrastructure and the like as counter-cyclical stabilization policy, which we are likely to need within the next couple of years. You got to hand it to the American Society of Civil Engineers. They issue a report card on a 4-year cycle. True to form would be if they released it in March. The last grade we got in 2013 was a D+, suggesting an infrastructure gap of $3.6 trillion. I would not say that the American Society of Civil Engineers is a disinterested party, but nonetheless, they are very clear about enumerating the sorts of capital projects that need to be remediated. So certainly the cost of these on the average cost per year should be included in your non-entitlement budget. Okay, so to summarize, we don't operate with a realistic assessment of the costs we are, we will, or we need to incur. In each of the 3 cases, long-lived capital, old age entitlement, or just annual expenditures, we don't set funding targets to cover these costs over any appropriate planning period, and the budget deficit, in basically any form, played essentially no role in the presidential campaign, certainly not for President-elect Trump. And so we can talk some of the specifics of this in the next section. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to all 4 of you for, wow, that was a tour de force. I heard a lot of facts, I heard history, frameworks, a bit of consternation, and even some glimmers of optimism. So that's about where we are. I think a lot of us in the country. So I'm going to open the conversation. I'll put to the panel maybe 1 or 2 kind of broad questions. I'd encourage anybody to jump in as they'd like. The first one is something that terrific faculty like us don't always naturally do, but it's to gaze into our crystal ball and kind of think about what the coming year of 2017 will bring. So we've got your expertise with your research and teaching in the 4 areas you touched upon. Imagine we're convening a panel like this, a series of forums, thanks Bob in advance, a year hence, on first-year panels. When we look at the array of the new administration, the new Congress, the issues in each of the areas you talked about, what's one thing you think is going to transpire in the areas that you gave us some insights on to start with this year in terms of policy? Like some new law that will be passed, some kerfuffle that won't lead anywhere, but what's one thing you think is kind of coming down the pike when you look at this year? And that's open to anybody, or I could cold call down the line if you'd like.
I feel like I have to weigh in on this. The repeal of the ACA or Obamacare is the first thing that Republicans in Congress will push Donald Trump to do, but I don't think they figured out what the alternative is. I mean, most of the ACA is wildly popular except for the individual mandate requiring people to buy private health insurance. They could try to roll back to pre-Obamacare. I think that's what's likely to happen. But then that would allow insurance companies to then roll back a number of things like pregnancy as a pre-existing condition again, that would keep you from getting health insurance and a variety of other things. The other direction is to go to some kind of what Donald Trump said, Medicare expansion, so Medicare for everybody. So when your kids at the age of 26 can no longer be on your health insurance, could they sign up for Medicare? I mean, that's a possibility, I guess. I think that the first thing I'm looking for to give me a sense of what the crystal ball will look like is what does Trump say and do on the ACA repeal.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, Dean. And sorry, quick two-hander. Will that be something that brings Comity up and down Pennsylvania Avenue between the new White House and Congress? Is this going to be something that's acrimonious and contentious?
I would
Given
say
your governance perspective.
acrimonious and contentious.
Okay, got it. Liz?
So I didn't sort of really describe what the sort of message was or what the plans were for K through 12 education. I think I've written down, kind of like Richard did here, sort of the exact language from Trump's website. They want an immediate additional federal investment of $20 billion to support school choice. So first of all, I'd say that the largest federal investment in education, K through 12 education right now, as I mentioned, was Title I. It's about $14 billion. So investments this large would be completely unprecedented. The other thing is, and it's sort of, I've thought about this when Dean spoke earlier, support for school choice doesn't fall neatly along party lines. For example, President Obama and Secretary Duncan were not hostile to school choice. In fact, I think that they supported charter school expansion. Black leaders are divided about charter schools. The NAACP actually put out a resolution last October proposing a moratorium on further charter school expansion, but a lot of the primary beneficiaries of charter programs are actually African American. And school choice really isn't going to be much of a boon to poor rural voters. So I'm really curious about how this is going to play out. I think very well a proposal could come down the line, but I think that this is going to end up, I'll be eating my words in a year, but it might very well end up being something that the Secretary of Education and Trump would use their bully pulpits to try to get Republican governors.
No, that's interesting. It connects with a lot of the insights Dean
Yeah.
shared about the cross currents and cleavages in terms of preferences and different interest groups. Okay, great. So school choice. Richard, immigration?
I'll speak with a relatively high degree of confidence for an academic that levels of deportation will not drop in the next 4 years. A little bit of history.
That's bold.
And until about 1995, somewhere between 40,000 people were deported a year. And if anybody who sort of tracks these data over time, for the last 20 years, rates of deportation have steepened quite noticeably. So from those rates of about, let's just say at the high end of that variability, it was like 50,000 a year. We currently operate somewhere north of 400,000 a year deportations. And all the signals are that those rates will not go down and might very well go up, depending on the budget and depending on how much Congress appropriates for either the Border Patrol or ICE, the Division of Homeland Security that works internal to the country as opposed to on the border and with 100 miles of the border.
Thank you. Andrew, in your fiscal crystal ball?
I have no such thing. In addition to repeal the ACA, cutting taxes broadly, though particularly for corporations, and boosting spending on public works like infrastructure. Those were two other reasonably well-specified campaign promises. Against that, the pick for OMB director is Mick Mulvaney, who is a Tea Party Republican from South Carolina, who was further to the right than most in the House leadership. In fact, was very vocally not supportive of Congressman Boehner's reappointment. So you got somebody as part of the shutdown caucus who is now the OMB director. I will be interested to see how that works, right? Whether we can sort of craft sensible budget policy when there's really nothing preventing the Republicans in the House and the Senate from crafting a budget policy. Look to see if they can actually do something that looks like the governing part of having a budget or not.
Great. Okay, thank you. So those are some useful prognostications we got on tape. So the other question I'll ask, one other broad one I'll open up to just the audience for their questions is, here we are at Dartmouth, right? This special institution of higher ed with great scholars and teachers, you four being great examples. Anything in your remit that we've talked about here that you think is going to be especially relevant for us at Dartmouth or higher education more generally in the year ahead? So not to ask a leading question, but Richard, you comment on a number of things on comprehensive immigration reform. One of the issues that would clearly perhaps play a role for higher education is the role of the H-1B visa program and high-skilled immigration more generally. So any fiscal issues in terms of the tax status of higher ed, Andrew, immigration, education, Liz, or Dean, I'm not sure what it'd be for governance, but any thoughts on things that are closer to home for us at Dartmouth?
Well, so when you have the need to cut expenditures, the piece of the budget that's called non-defense discretionary, it's a little over 3% of GDP total out of the roughly 20% of GDP that's expenditures. That's the part that gets hardest hit, and we are in that, right? And so I would expect that the climate for federal funding for basic research will not improve for us, and I think that will have repercussions up and down our income statement.
Duly noted.
I have two answers.
Please.
One short, one a little less short.
Yeah.
We're currently hiring a climatologist in my department. A lot of these people get funding from NASA. They're looking to NSF and other sources of funding right now as I speak. One of the things Donald Trump talked a lot about in the last year is Muslim refugees and Muslim immigration. And I'm going to answer this question in a very odd way. We do not have a course on the books at Dartmouth that is exclusively devoted to refugees. And I would like to see in the next 4 years we develop such a course.
Thank you.
I'll add a significant growth in the popularity of government as a major.
That's awesome. Oh, economics is going to continue to grow as well.
Yeah.
Yes. So since I'm talking about education, I'll just read to you what his higher education priorities are, and then we can cogitate a little bit on what that might mean. So work with Congress on reforms to ensure universities are making a good faith effort to reduce the cost of college and student debt in exchange for the federal tax breaks and tax dollars. Again, I'm reading verbatim from the website. And ensure that the opportunity to attend a 2 or 4 year college or to pursue a trade, et cetera, will be easier to access, pay for, and finish. These are pretty vacuous. They're not fleshed out at all. So I don't know really what that means. I mean, President Obama had pushed toward accountability in higher education.
Right, report cards for higher ed.
in terms of, it's sort of through the executive branch entirely. And I don't, and really sort of exposed some of the problems at for-profit institutions. I mean, it's not Dartmouth, but I don't know. I don't see President Trump being interested in pursuing for-profit institutions, possibly. So,
Got it.
yeah.
Why don't we open the conversation to this full house? So there may be a lot of people that want to ask a question, which would be great. I'll moderate the questions. If you have a question that's directed towards a particular panelist, please indicate that. If it's a broader question, we'll just let them respond as they like. Again, I will gently, on behalf of all of us here, ask for questions, not statements or other interventions. So maybe just raise your hand. I'm sorry, I don't know if, Greg, we have microphones. And folks can pass these around. Maybe tell us who you are in the community.
David Russell, retired banker. Really, this is to Dean Lacy. The Republicans have been historically indifferent to deficits when they're in office. And you have this dichotomy that exists right now between the statements of the Republican majority in terms of their conservatism and the statements of the president-elect in terms of his expansionist happens. What happens?
So I can explain this in part. I just did an experiment with a Dartmouth student. We did a national survey experiment and confirmed something we'd found a year ago, and that is that so I won't go into the details of it, but we gave subjects news stories where members of Congress had announced a spending project in the district, and we varied whether the member of Congress was a Republican, a Democrat, or there was no party given. Republicans get and then after the experiment, so the people read the news story, then we asked them to rate the member of Congress. Republican members of Congress get an increase in approval for increasing social spending. Democrats don't. And that increase comes in particular from independents and from Republicans. So in other words, Republicans can buy off independent and Republican voters, gain their approval by opening the gates for social spending programs that Democrats can't. That's why when Republicans govern, they don't cut spending like we'd anticipate. Now, what does this mean for tax cuts plus no decreases in spending? We're back to the 80s with an increase in budget deficits potentially unless we see significant economic growth. So people who are looking for a decline in budget deficits, I don't see it coming, especially given the regional preferences that I talked about, where there's not a program that Republicans could cut that they could get a majority behind, because there's always some coalition of Republicans who like anything from the Farm Bill to housing subsidies to SNAP, that's the food stamps, which are tied to the Farm Bill every time it's voted on. So I just don't see fiscal conservatism. It always runs into the re-election motivation for Republicans and Democrats alike.
And I'll say to our panelists, anybody should feel free to jump in on anybody's response as they like, right, to keep the conversation going. Good. Sorry, over here, please.
I'm William Stone. I'm a retired attorney and the spouse of a Tuck faculty member. For the whole panel, do you think there will be a meaningful shift of governmental activity in general from the federal government to the states? And what do you think that would look like if that's the case?
I don't think it will be intentional. I'm really worried that we have an administration that, as Dean said, has really no prior experience. So staffing up and doing the things we expect the federal government to do, if they're not meeting taxpayer needs, or citizens' needs, it's going to devolve to the states, and the states will be confronted with it. That may not be the worst thing for fiscal responsibility, because states have far less latitude to run large budget deficits. And so I think you're on to a shift that might occur, possibly intentionally, but I think more of it unintentionally.
In terms of immigration, that shift has already occurred. Because of the lack of will to pass or even engage with a debate over comprehensive immigration reform, much of immigration law has devolved to states and municipalities, and you see this divide that people point to, such as the evolution of sanctuary cities from just places that offered sanctuary to Salvadoran migrants fleeing a devastating civil war in the late 1970s, early 1980s, to now having a more broader remit, as well as states passing more legislation that provides a hostile environment for the undocumented, and more broadly for people who have a brown skin or speak with a Spanish accent. So that move has already occurred, and if comprehensive immigration reform doesn't occur at the through congressional action, I think we'll see states and municipalities taking on that kind of responsibility.
We've entered an era of reduced federal control of education right now, and I think that's likely to continue unless Congress really gets active in sort of spending more on education, which I guess isn't out of the realm of possibility, but I think is unlikely.
And I'll add that Trump is the first Republican going back at least since Barry Goldwater who didn't run on a platform of states' rights and devolution. Reagan did, Bush did. That was a linchpin of the Republican platform, but Trump said very little about it. It's another mystery.
All right. My name is Pascal Mensah. I'm a T18. And my question is around infrastructure development. It looks like that's the only thing Trump talked about that might gain some bipartisan support. But if you look at the economy today, it looks like unemployment is almost, the country is approaching full employment. And Janet Yellen might raise interest rate again. So the question is, if they do implement this $1 trillion infrastructure spending, wouldn't that actually at some point have a negative effect in case, one, on the national deficit, and two, causing the economy to overheat, which might cause them to raise interest rate even faster?
Well, I've been wrong on this before, like last year. Initial claims for unemployment insurance have been below 300,000 for 97 weeks. I don't think that's a steady state. I think that's the crest of a business cycle. I would have wanted them to tee up a set of projects that could be deployed soon and, with intention. So no, I'm not worried about overheating or the like. I think this will turn out, if it can happen, to be reasonably good countercyclical fiscal stabilization policy. You know, that said, I think President-elect Trump has to make a better case for the particular financing of this that he wants. I mean, you could just decide that you want to raise taxes somewhere and devote the money to investments that will eventually pay off in higher productivity for the public and private sectors later on. He instead wants to give tax credits for private funders to come in and do infrastructure projects. But why would they do that unless there's a revenue source on the other side? And so in order to get this done in the way he's doing it, he's going to have to make the case that the value to the recipients of this investment is sufficiently worth it that they'd be willing to pay for it. But that has been a Republican problem for decades now, is that they really don't make arguments of the form, it's worth paying for this because the benefits are greater than the costs. They've gotten out of the habit of doing it. I wish him well in being able to do it, but it'll be the first time we've seen it in a long time.
Right. So I'm happy to cold call our students that are here. I'm sure there are a lot of good questions from this side of the room. Please.
Hi, Abina Frempong, Dartmouth 17. This is specifically for Professor Wright, but again, anybody can contribute. I know you mentioned the day 1 or day 3 or day 7 repeal of DACA and DAPA. Do you think that has the possibility to look like more of an expansion of making it easier to extend visa rights, as you looked at the numbers that illegal immigrants tend to be those who have overstayed visa? Or is it going to look more like an Arizona situation where we have a lot more forced deportations on the spot?
Yeah, I think the latter. I don't know about, I don't think we'll see changes in visa like the H-1B. That's a very hard one to predict because it's controversial. There's people on both sides of that. And I don't know what Donald Trump thinks about that particular visa. So H-1Bs are they're interesting visas because they're dual intent visas. They are you can come if you have some skills, particularly STEM type skills. You can come to the United States and private employers can hire you. And basically, you're tied. The employer gets the visa, and through that, you can now then apply for legal permanent residence and green card. Universities use them too. There's a cap on private employers, but for universities, there's no cap. So, for example, you might have figured out that I am an immigrant. I did my graduate work in the United States, came here, got an H-1B, and then switched to a green card. And there's no cap on people like me, but for private employers, the cap is $60,000 a year. It fluctuates a lot. It's gone as high as 120. But I don't see the focus of Donald Trump right now is on the undocumented population, and that's front and center. And then secondarily, it's on refugees, and there's a real shame about the refugees. I talked about the lack of attention in our curriculum to this. But you all should be aware that we are right now at this present moment, we can think about ourselves in the present moment, political moment in the United States, but globally, the crisis in Syria is the worst refugee crisis since World War II. We should be aware of this. There are 7 million people, or were, in Syria. 2 million are internally displaced. 2 million more are displaced internationally. So these are enormous numbers, and the United States' role in responding to this humanitarian crisis is abysmal. Something on the order of, 10, 20,000 people. Other countries are opening their doors. Yes, Merkel's paying a political price for this, but she's doing the right thing. Canada is letting in tens of thousands. Do we hear anything in the press about the Canada position on this? No, we don't. We hear about Merkel paying a political price because of the misbehavior of, a handful of men at some event in a square in Germany, or we hear about some terrorist action in Europe and attach that to refugees. Many of these are children. They are not terrorists yet. You want to ignore them and treat them like dirt, they might very well become terrorists. But if you give them dignity and abide by universal laws that have been ratified by the United Nations, maybe we'll deal with that situation. So of all the things that Donald Trump has said, that the target on Muslims and the racialization of Muslims in particular ways, particularly as terrorists, for me is the most disturbing.
Well,
I kind of hate to move away from that topic, Richard, because I think it's so important and you speak so well on it. But I'm going to shift back to the budget because that's my question. Sorry. But you've gotten, the whole panel's gotten me sufficiently concerned, I guess, about the budget problem that I'd like to think about that for a minute. I guess I'd like to see if there's any optimism, hope for optimism at all. Is there any kind of a silver bullet in terms of potential for tax revenues? I mean, if you're worried about the budget deficit and we're going to increase spending, is there any way that we can increase tax revenues without doing too much damage? And maybe it's a caricature, but I think of the Kennedy and Reagan base broadening, rate lowering tax plans. Is there any possibility of something like that coming out of the Trump administration and the Republican Congress, broadening the base, maybe getting rid of some very beloved deductions, and in conjunction maybe a lower corporate and personal tax rates that would actually raise revenues? Any possibility? Or a border tax or something?
Well,
give me a silver bullet.
So there's no magic in some sort of economic supply response to what is essentially a revenue neutral tax change. You get a small bump to allocative efficiency if you think we're over-investing in housing relative to, say, equipment and software investing. A cash flow tax, which seems like it's an interesting place to start, right? I would have probably gone on the way station to let's move from a worldwide to a territorial tax and harmonize the rate with our major trade partners. So we just look like the rest of the world and we don't discourage firms from repatriating their earnings back to the U.S. where they might go for some domestic investment. That would have been where I would start. I might calibrate the rate as high as possible to raise revenue. That would have been where I would start. But these notions that you cut the rate, you broaden the base, you get the difference. You don't get some first order effect. We would stop investing in housing if you got rid of most of the mortgage interest deduction. The reduction in activity in housing would largely offset most of the increment to the activity in what other place was previously not tax preferred that is now relatively speaking advantaged. So it's a lot of movement for a small impact on economic activity and therefore net revenue. I continue to think that our biggest problem is that we don't raise enough revenue to cover our expenditures, not the various ways in which we don't raise that revenue. So my hope is, my optimism would be that particularly the OMB director, starts cracking the whip. Let me just give you a quote from this gentleman. It was out of a PBS article that I found. Mick Mulvaney, was an early backer of Trump during the presidential campaign, noting that the Republican billionaire had tapped into a populist sentiment dissatisfied with Washington. And this is the quote: "If you want to know, members of Congress, why you have Donald Trump, go look in the mirror, because we've overpromised and underdelivered for so long." That's like classic throwback Republican, it's not the tax cuts that matter, it's the budget balance. And in his life as a Tea Party Republican, he suggested on several occasions across the board cuts, not sparing the military budget. So the optimism would be that a lot of power is invested in the OMB director, and he leads the effort to direct what's going on with the President's Legislative Affairs Office toward the Congress. So if you force me to be optimistic, that's where I'm going to locate it.
Dean, any intervention on top of that?
My optimism would have been that one of the largest chunks of the federal budget is military spending. 20% of the total budget, a little more than half of what you pay in income taxes every year, goes to that military spending. Now, Trump has said he wouldn't cut military spending at the same time he wants to pull back. And it could be that pulling back from the world, reducing our troop commitments overseas, could involve a reduction in military spending, but not if you're also making careless statements about Russia and China and other potential adversaries. So I'd say that slice of the budget that's military could really go up, or it could shrink a little during a Trump administration. And it wouldn't be our choice; it would be our adversary's choice.
I'll use moderator's prerogative and add an optimistic hope, which is an acceleration in non-farm labor productivity growth. So in Andrew's narrative earlier, in the background, we've got the real economy chugging along. The surge in tax revenues and the fiscal surpluses we enjoyed for a few years in the late 90s and early 2000s had a lot to do with acceleration in productivity growth. So independent of the bases and the rates and that dynamic, if there's things that Congress, the administration does, or innovation here on campus and in Silicon Valley accelerates the speed limit rate of growth, that'd be good. So we'll see. There's a person here with a question.
So recently there's
Sorry, who are you?
Catherine McAvoy, Dartmouth 17.
Thank you.
Recently there's been a lot of talk of defunding Planned Parenthood, especially with Vice President-elect Mike Pence's opposition to the organization. Do you think it's possible that Planned Parenthood could be defunded? And if it is, what would be the impact financially, health-wise, or otherwise?
Yes and bad.
Any other panelists on that?
Yes, it could be defunded, and I think it could be offset by an increase in fundraising and private donations.
Well, funding can be lowered, but the part of it that's the 501c3, you want to fund Planned Parenthood, contribute, and the government subsidizes that at your marginal tax rate. And so that's the strategy to protect it from being defunded.
Hi, Maxwell Canefield. I'm a Dartmouth 19. Since the title of the talk is Opportunities and Risks, and we focused heavily on the risks, perhaps rightly so, I'd like to hear, perhaps since we've already heard from Professor Samwick and Dean Lacy about a couple opportunities from you, Professor Wright, and you, Professor Cascio, perhaps each of you could name one potential opportunity that you see with this incoming administration in both the White House and in Congress.
I talked about comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, it's part of the plank, and I'm in favor of that. I guess the real question is, what would that look like? But your suspicions should be, if you have a House and a Senate that are both Republican, they pretty much know their positions on immigration. So I think there won't be an amnesty clause in there, whereas if there was maybe a split between the House and the Senate, you'd see some horse trading there. So I don't think there's going to be an amnesty clause. Whether you want one or not, that's a different question. But I think you will see maybe within, let's suppose comprehensive immigration reform goes forward. Immigration law in the United States is premised, the linchpin of immigration law in the United States is premised on family reunification. If you go back to the 1920s, it's actually very much part of the 1920s law. It did other things too, but the cornerstone of that work was family reunification. I could imagine a new Congress, the current as constituted with our president-elect, rethinking that and de-emphasizing family reunification and accenting more different kinds of economic opportunity. Is that?
So I'm going to start with a risk again, just for a second. I mean, my biggest concern about education policy with the new administration is that they're pressing forward based on ideology and not evidence. And actually, sort of the shift towards sort of evidence-based policy in education at the federal level started under George W. Bush with the establishment of the Institute of Education Sciences. So there's been a push toward evidence-based policy. Now, I think just through sheer force of will, they will be able to move along school choice along a number of dimensions at the state level, probably more than at the federal level. And the silver lining of that is we could actually, if researchers plan in advance and we can sort of get the data, we could actually learn something from it going forward. And I think that would be very positive. I haven't really had a chance to talk about that evidence, but I mean, it's not all bad. There are some incredibly high-performing charter schools, for example, that have been very good over not just the short term, but over the medium term for participants, and that's pretty convincing work. But there's also a lot of evidence suggesting that not all the conditions for school choice to be as productive as it could be are met in practice most of the time. So.
Good. Thank you. So a couple opportunities there. Thank you. Sorry, in the back, I guess. Oh,
yeah.
Kate.
Hi, Kate Barnett, Tuck 2018. If we look at the Rust Belt, which did vote for Trump, and a lot of individuals who, lost good-paying factory jobs due to, maybe it's technology, maybe it's trade, maybe it's some combination of the two of them. Are their lives going to get any better?
I think one of the first things Trump will do is boost the coal industry through a variety of measures, to which is reducing environmental restrictions, and so that would apply to western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and parts of West Virginia. I think their lives could get better. Not just the miners, but also the people who work in mine towns where you could see a potential mining boom. The rest of the factory workers working in steel mills and places where there just aren't jobs anymore, I don't see a significant change. There was hope. I think they had hope in voting for Trump, but this is a long-term structural problem that knows no party, and I don't think either party has a good solution.
I don't think those jobs are coming back. Through automation, through globalization. But it's been interesting, right, to see the tweets from President-elect Trump and the reaction by some pretty major corporations. So Ford deciding to site a plant in Michigan as opposed to Mexico, and the logic being, after a kind of gesture from President-elect Trump, and the logic being, well, there's a new demand for larger vehicles, and that's better met with a U.S. site. So I think something to look for is to see how the power of these, these pronouncements that come out at various times during the 24-hour day, and the corporate reaction to them. And I think everyone wants to know, are they going to have an effect or not? But there are these big structural forces, as Dean points out, that, so manufacturing is less than 10%, less than 9% of the U.S. workforce. I mean, it was in the 30s, back in those nostalgic days. We are not going to go back to 30% employment in manufacturing. It is not going to happen. So, and the location of those jobs is going to be different. So if you think of automobile production in the United States, focused on the Rust Belt that you pointed out, or I would prefer to think of as a manufacturing belt, the historic manufacturing belt, auto production is very, very decentralized now. It's a corridor running from southern Ontario through to northern Mexico. Yes, it has a concentration still around the Great Lakes, but it's far more diffuse than it ever was before. So if we just take that one very key sector in the American economy, and let's say there are these moments where corporations have second thoughts about where to open a new plant, it's not necessarily the case. It'll even be in the location that you highlighted. It could very well be in Alabama or Mississippi or, Arkansas.
So Liz or Andrew, a quick follow-up on that. Do you see if, in the time ahead, if those jobs aren't coming back, to help those workers gain new skills, move to where the new jobs are being created? Do you see some sort of social safety net education expansion? Yes, no?
So maybe this will come back to you as a professor of international economics. Does trade adjustment assistance work at all And
No.
why not? And why aren't people working on a better version of that that would actually concentrate the benefits where they're supposed to go?
We have a social safety net for workers, trade adjustment assistance, and unemployment insurance that was created generations ago when the nature and duration of job separation is very different from what they are today. So the labor market social safety net we have is poorly designed and underfunded. Why we don't have something different is above my pay grade to know the answer to. But it's a great question. So we'll see.
I didn't
I'm
know there was
optimistic.
anything.
I'll say I'm hoping yes. A question somewhere over here, Greg. Thank you.
My name is Jennifer West, and I'm an undergraduate 20. My question is regarding education, and more specifically, a cause that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's Title IX. So I'm curious in sort of two dimensions. Number one, looking at general gender equality in academia, we're still not at 50%, especially in faculty hiring and lots of other like math and science programs. And that's something that the Obama administration was really pushing, and I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not you'll see more of that. And then in the second dimension, in terms of sexual assault on college campuses, it was one of Vice President Biden's signature issues, and the next administration looks like it may have some very different views regarding that.
Possibly. I mean, I would say that is certainly part of the job of the Department of Education to protect everybody, students' 14th Amendment rights. But as I said, I mean, there has been historically variation across administration in the vigor of enforcement of those. And so I think the Obama administration was very interested in sort of working toward protecting everyone's civil rights. I think, I think there will be a lot of, how do I say this? Talk about civil rights, but it's going to have different meaning in this administration. For example, school choice is a civil right in this administration. So that is sort of going to, there's going to be a lot of wordsmithing and sort of changing of the dialogue. So just keep your eyes open for that.
There's a question here.
So you touched briefly on President-elect Trump's campaign promises and his inclination to make fiscal policy choices in tax cuts that have the potential to really blow up the national debt. So I'm wondering, from a poli-sci perspective, are those promises likely to be passed, given like Speaker Ryan is more of a debt hawk than other people? So will those things get passed? And two, if the debt really does blow up, Professor Samwick, can you provide some, like a more concrete look at what that could mean? Would we start to see the effects of a huge debt within the Trump presidency?
Yeah, I'll start with the re-election motivation keeps members of Congress from taking any action long term. They're thinking 2 years or 6 years hence, and in Donald Trump's case, maybe 4 years hence. And that prevents any real change or cuts in the budget because each member of Congress has their own pet projects in their own district. I mean, the problem ultimately is us and our reliance on federal spending broadly, but everybody has something that they're getting from the federal government in some form or another, and we re-elect members of Congress to bring those back to us. Paul Ryan will protect what goes to Wisconsin, and every other Republican will protect what goes to their state. I don't see him being able to forge a coalition to cut the budget broadly. And the deficit can always, and the debt just gets kicked down to the next administration, the next member of Congress, as we've been doing for decades.
So I would only object to the characterization of Speaker Ryan as a deficit hawk. If you were a deficit hawk, he might have voted for Simpson Bowles when that vote was important and could have mattered. I mean, Simpson Bowles had the audacious goal of stabilizing both revenues and expenditures at 21% of GDP by 2035. The best thing they could do would be to shift to that baseline and do it immediately, and then continue their appropriate functions of figuring out what are modifications we need to make to this baseline to achieve better policy goals. I don't think I'll be very disappointed and a little bit surprised if they go on another individual income tax rate tax cutting rampage. That would surprise me, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. I think the bigger threats are going to be that within a few years we'll have some pretty strong economic headwinds against us, the budget deficit will start to widen, and we may no longer be in the global savings glut, low interest rate environment, and so we may actually have to start paying real costs of that in real time.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Zach, and I am a Dartmouth 20. And my question has to do with the $5 trillion that lie overseas that belong to U.S. corporations, and to what extent that, in your opinion, will be exploited by the new administration to either close up the deficit for at least this coming year, if not to stimulate the economy in the future 4 years.
I don't really think it moves the needle on the deficit for reasons you hinted at, which is that it would be a one-time event. There has been some discussion in the policy about infrastructure. Would be that somehow we would couple repatriation of those earnings with the tax credits to help support the private sector funding of infrastructure. The details seem a little hazy as they're discussed, and even more hazy in my own thinking about it. Look, I wanted to move to a territorial system for the corporate income tax precisely so we could stop worrying about this.
And I'll add to Andrew's wise answer. We had an example of this repatriation holiday in 2004. U.S. Congress passed a bill called AJGA, the American Jobs Creation Act. And some good academic research was done to look at what the companies did. And the short answer is if you have a company that really isn't struggling to raise funds for various investments, they might do some things with their balance sheet, but they don't run out and hire a lot of new people, undertake a lot of new research and development, the kind of things that might accelerate productivity growth and things people hope for. And so if anything, there's almost no evidence that companies operating in the United States today, most of them are not having trouble accessing capital markets for those kinds of investments. So there might be fiscal reasons to do that kind of thing. But those who voice aspirations that will create millions of jobs and that forth, that's a little optimistic. So we had a lot of great questions from this full house. In the few minutes we have left, I do want to give our esteemed panelists, based on what they heard each other say and the questions, if there's any closing thoughts that you might want to share with our audience. Reminding everyone, this is day one of a series of 4 days of panels. Tomorrow afternoon's topic being some global issues. Thank you. Some of which we touched upon today on refugees, for example. But any last thoughts from our panelists for the conversation today?
I'll offer an optimistic note, which is that as a president with zero prior political experience, where the office of the president is not going to be his primary occupation or source of income or wealth or prestige, maybe Donald Trump will be the first to ignore all these political constraints that we've been talking about and focus on results rather than the political process.
I will predict that rates of naturalization will rise, and I think that's another good thing. So there's, among the immigrant population, the foreign-born 40 million people, there are about a quarter of that population is undocumented, about a quarter of them, maybe a third, a good portion are legal permanent residents that are eligible to naturalize. And I think it's a good thing that people naturalize if they're legal permanent residents after the 3 or the 5 year window, depending on the reason you're an LPR. So I think we'll see rates of naturalization increase, just as we saw in the mid-1990s after the Gingrich Congress assumed power and became very hostile toward the foreign-born.
I guess I'll say that one of the reasons why we wanted to put together a series of panels was to help us figure out how we can hold the new government accountable to the will of the people. We have basically 2, more likely 4 years, just because of the way the electoral map for the midterm elections is drawn. There would be senators who came in 2012, which was not a big Republican year to come in. So we're likely to have 4 years to figure out where the Republican Party wants to be. They were written off after 2012 as not being nationally competitive. And then all of a sudden, sort of behind the scenes, Donald Trump, the outsider, and Reince Priebus, the insider, got together and figured out a strategy to win. So I'm interested to see whether policy moves in the direction of solidifying that as a Republican base that could continue to win elections at the presidential level. There are no impediments to the Republicans actually articulating policies that they want to see get across. And the first one will be, what do they do, if anything, on the budget? About whom are they going to complain if that budget process breaks down? So this is one place where over a series of years we can hold them accountable to doing the things that we expect governments to do.
Finally, sort of speaking as an academic, I'm really excited about all that I'm going to learn over the next 4 years about school choice. And that actually, it's not just sort of, personally going to benefit me personally, but I think it's sort of a benefit for everyone. There's going to be a big impetus to learn a lot more about this or increase the rate at which we're learning, and that will pay off over the years to come.
Yeah, that's great. And remember, the heart of what we do here at Dartmouth is we've got great faculty like the four up here that do research and teaching, and the students with the great questions in our broader community. It's that learning that we aspire to do. So everybody, again, that helped organize these panels, I really appreciate it. I know I speak for everybody here in thanking the organizers, thanking the audience, and especially thanking our four faculty to lead us off in the conversation this week. Thanks, everybody.